Well, the Justice Department reports that children exposed to violence are more likely to engage in criminal behavior, to suffer from depression, and to abuse drugs and alcohol. The Attorney General's National Task Force on Children's Exposure to Violence last month began gathering evidence and hearing testimony in Baltimore. The task force heard about how a weak economy and high unemployment can exacerbate the problem.
Exposure to violence. Staggering numbers of children are exposed to violence in a multitude of ways every day. The next panel will introduce a broad framework for understanding the complex and pervasive nature of children's exposure to violence. Children's exposure to violence occurs across all races and socioeconomic situations and affects children of all ages. It can be direct and acute, and it can be a daily reality for children who witness violence in their communities. Many branches of social services serve these children. Therefore, diverse professional perspectives are essential to addressing the issue of children's exposure to violence. This panel will discuss the issue from the perspectives of law, medicine, law enforcement, and research. Children's experiences of violence are often hidden or kept a secret. This panel will help to open a conversation about the widespread and insidious nature of childhood exposure to violence. And I want to introduce to you our panel, Dr. Howard Dubowitz. He's the head of the Division of Child Protection and Director, Center for Families. He has studied the problems of child neglect and family violence for 35 years and is widely known for his work on the problem of childhood sexual abuse. Dr. Jeffrey Edelson is a professor and director of research at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work and is director of the Minnesota Center Against Violence and Abuse. He has authored a best practices guide for addressing the domestic violence that is utilized around the country. Chief Marshal T. Goodwin has been chief of police for Baltimore City Schools since 2007. Prior to his appointment, Chief Goodwin retired from Baltimore City Sheriff's Office at the rank of Major and has also served in the Maryland House of Delegates. Ms. Sheila Beatty leads the Southern Poverty Law Center's efforts on behalf of children in Mississippi and Louisiana. Ms. Beatty directed efforts to close a notoriously abusive girls' prison and continues to represent imprisoned children in suits challenging unconstitutional prison conditions. Dr. Dubowitz.
Good afternoon, and I'm really grateful for the chance to share a few thoughts with you this afternoon. And I have to say, listening to the Attorney General earlier today, I was struck by how much we know and what can I possibly say that's going to be new. But often I feel that the problem, perhaps the tragedy, is not what we don't know, but how we ignore what we do know. We do know that many American kids are exposed to violence, directly, indirectly. We have about 75 million children in our country, and incredibly, each year, there are reports of possible abuse or neglect for over 6 million children. And that is the tip of the iceberg, because we also know that this is a problem that often happens behind closed doors and is kept darkly secret. Studies have steadily shown, for example, that as many as 1 in 5 girls and perhaps 1 in 10 boys experience sexual abuse. And as you'll hear from other panelists, many kids are exposed to violence between their parents or adults in the home, as well as other forms of violence. The Attorney General said it perfectly. We have a national epidemic. It's important how we define violence, and some forms are obviously obvious, but others are less so. For example, corporal punishment or hitting kids remains widely accepted, and some believe it's even necessary. However, we have lots and lots of evidence of how hitting children can harm them and make them more aggressive. I think it's reasonable to conclude that corporal punishment, hitting kids, really is a form of child maltreatment. It's a form of violence. Another, I think, interesting issue concerns child neglect. And you probably know that 2/3 of what gets reported to our child welfare system actually concerns neglect. For example, when kids go hungry, this too might be construed as another form of violence. I should quickly add, though, that this is seldom parents intentionally not giving their kids food. Rather, it's in the context of poverty and not enough to go around. So perhaps we can think of this as a form of societal neglect or violence. We know we're paying a very high price, literally, figuratively, for kids' exposure to violence. There is enormous evidence of both the short and the long-term serious harm and the costs. More than 3 kids are killed due to child abuse and neglect in an average day. For example, studies have shown that abused and neglected kids are at risk for juvenile delinquent and then adult criminal behavior. Other studies have found very serious medical and mental health problems, including cancer, heart disease, 50 years down the road. One conservative estimate is that we're paying over $100 billion a year related to this problem. So very, very clearly, the suffering and the costs of this are enormous. We've also learned a great deal about what contributes to violence and child maltreatment, and it's not simply about bad parents. Rather, there are usually multiple contributors, including aspects of our culture, of our society. So, again, for example, despite plenty of rhetoric about our children being our nation's most valuable resource, I'm sorry, but the evidence says otherwise. How do we explain 9 million children without any health insurance? Hard to hear, sorry. Is this on? Okay. How do we explain the lousy public schools in so much of the country? Thinking of many families struggling with unemployment, housing evictions, and the many burdens of poverty, it's not a big mystery how abuse or neglect may occur. In fact, thinking of families living a few blocks from where we're sitting, in dangerous neighborhoods, infested with violence, with crime, with drugs, and with very few supports, the mystery for me, actually, is how many families manage to do pretty well. I'm not sure how well I would do under those circumstances. So understanding what's underpinning the violence and child abuse and neglect should really guide us as we seek to tackle this big problem. Like enlightened police chiefs who have long realized the advantages of prevention over punishment and revolving jail doors, we need to be smarter, more strategic, and make prevention a priority. And here are 6 ideas, I think, of how we could help prevent child abuse and neglect. The first is the problem cries out for strong national leadership on children's issues, perhaps having a cabinet-level position for children and youth. The Attorney General, too, has a useful bully pulpit. And having some good mid-level folks or officers within agencies is just not good enough. Number 2, developing a really sustained public education campaign to help create a culture that really values kids. So if we could harness the geniuses of marketing, the folks who convince Americans in the suburbs that they need a Jeep, if we could harness that genius to promote ideas and practices that will serve children as well as their parents and families, that would be wonderful. And leaders in the entertainment industry and religious institutions should be important allies. Number 3, if we would ban corporal punishment in the home, as 29 other countries have done, and I realize a complex issue, but at a minimum, this would send a powerful statement of how we think children deserve to be treated. The 4th idea is that our need to address the underlying contributors, the circumstances that are the root of this problem. It's not enough to simply treat the symptom. Let's hope that the proposed changes in the healthcare system will ensure access to those 9 million children. But proposals to add jobs, help for those at risk of losing their homes, efforts to tackle poverty need our strong support, and children and families will benefit. The 5th idea is that we should do better at disseminating promising prevention strategies, such as home visiting programs for new parents. These have been found to be effective in lowering the rate of abuse and neglect. The 6th, we also need to invest more in the development and testing of new prevention strategies. If prevention is so important, we do have to learn more about how to do better in this area. Shifting to after the fact, much can be done to help abused and neglected kids and their families. This can lessen the likelihood of those bad outcomes and also help prevent further abuse and neglect. And here are 4 ideas. Most abused and neglected children remain with their families. We need more and better resources to help families take good care of their kids, such as parenting programs, parenting support programs. A second idea is so much time and money goes into investigating child abuse and neglect, yet relatively few cases are prosecuted. Some, perhaps much of that money, would be better spent on services strengthening and supporting families. Number 3, abused and neglected children themselves often need services. So this trickle-down approach of only attending to the parents' needs and trusting that the children too will benefit is not enough. And the final one here is, in general, there's a great need to strengthen the family court system with its high caseloads, its low status, and often revolving masters and judges. The quality of decision-making often leaves much to be desired. A nice example of having a clinic attached to the court, developed by Judge Cindy Lederman in Florida, is an idea that really is worth replicating. My last thought is to really urge you to strongly recommend that the Senate ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is a wonderful blueprint for what a decent society would aim to ensure for its children. And it should be a bipartisan no-brainer. As you likely know, only Somalia and the United States have not yet ratified this convention. So, I hope that these few thoughts are helpful as you consider how to improve our response to the many, many children exposed to many forms of violence. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me today. It's an honor to be here. And I'm going to focus primarily on the issue of children's exposure to domestic violence. I want to start by just speaking to the definition of exposure, because under many state laws, it's within sight or sound of the violence. And I think there's probably a much broader experience that children have with domestic violence that calls for a broader definition. And I think in the social science literature, that definition has expanded over the last 20 years from being an eyewitness or speaking about witnessing domestic violence to children who are exposed to domestic violence or experience it. Because that exposure includes the events leading up to the violent incident itself, and the many different cascading events that follow that a single incident. So I don't think we should be focused in our definitions of exposure, and I'm talking about the indirect exposure to violence of children being exposed to domestic violence between adults in their homes. I don't think we should focus on the term witnessing or eyewitnessing or within sight or sound, but thinking about that broad experience that children have. Even living in a shelter, in the aftermath of violence, there can be many different experiences that I would pose are part of that exposure experience to domestic violence. I also, and I've written about this, I question whether child exposure to domestic violence in our current context should be defined as child maltreatment. I think of it as child maltreatment, but I don't think that our systems are sufficiently supported in order to respond to children exposed to domestic violence. And the one experience I can tell you about in detail is Minnesota's experience when we redefined child exposure to family violence broadly as a form of child neglect under our state statutes, and it ended up overwhelming our child welfare system with about 50% increase in new child protection screenings and investigations, led to actually fewer services for abused children because there were no new funds for this change in law, and the resources had to be moved from services to screening and investigation. So during the 9 months that was in place in Minnesota, we had a huge increase in screenings and investigation, a decrease in services. And together, the child welfare system administrators and the domestic violence network in the state got together very quickly, unanimously for the first time in their history, to lobby for the repeal of that law under Minnesota statutes, and it was repealed. And sadly, though, upon repeal, now 50% fewer children are being reported to child protection. So on one level, we had a lot more reporting, but we had no new resources, sort of an unfunded mandate. On the other hand, we know about these children, but we're not reporting them. And I really think there's a third way that we need to support, which is a community-based, outside of the child welfare system, but more of a voluntary system of supports for children and their families who have been exposed to domestic violence in the community. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. In terms of, I was asked to talk about the scope, and David Finkelhor will be on the next panel. He is part of the team that did the national survey on children exposed to domestic violence that was published just 2 years ago, and they continue to publish a number of papers on that. As Howard said, 75 million children in the U.S., and then when you think about that under the NatSev, the national survey, 6.6% of American children were exposed to physical assault between their parents in the last year. 6.6% of all children between 0 and under 18. 17.9% of children of all ages exposed to physical violence since birth, between parents since birth. But one real key factor in that survey is they interviewed directly 14 to 17-year-olds. Under 14, they interviewed the caregivers. That's the first time that I've seen 14 to 17-year-olds directly surveyed, and those children, 27.7% of them said that they had been exposed to parents physically fighting during their lifetime. So that's more than 1 in 4 children in the U.S., and you can extrapolate that to the 75 million figure that Howard gave. They also found that a third, 33.9% of children who had been exposed to parents fighting in their home were also directly maltreated in their home. So a third during the past year, compared to 8.6% of kids that were not exposed to violence between their parents. And then when they looked over lifetime, over half, 56.8% of children exposed to domestic violence in their homes were also maltreated sometime during their lifetime. So there's a huge co-occurrence of these issues in families. Other studies, John Fantuso, nearby at the University of Pennsylvania, and his colleagues studied 5 different cities, the police reports from 5 different cities, and when police arrived on domestic assault calls, 0 to 5-year-old children, very young children, were disproportionately present, which raises a big red flag for a lot of the child protection systems around the country. And that those children, because they're not in school, they're not able to leave the house on their own, they're often playing in the house, supervised by a parent, that they're more likely to be there and stay there during adult domestic assaults. Also, there's data on children's exposure to homicides and attempted homicides. That's in my written testimony. And one issue that a lot of people aren't aware of is that more than half of the residents of battered women's shelters are children. So I usually trick people in audiences. I ask them, what percentage of the residents of your shelter are battered women? And even the shelter advocates say 100%. But in fact, it's more than half of the children of more than half of the residents in American shelters are children. The impact of this violence has been found to have similar impacts of direct maltreatment. So the impact of indirect exposure to domestic violence can have similar impacts on children as being a direct victim of child physical or sexual abuse. A recent meta-analysis found that of 60 different studies found that boys in particular showed much greater likelihood of using antisocial and aggressive behavior, and overall children showed much greater presence of trauma symptoms as a result of being exposed or associated with being exposed to domestic violence. We also know that children physically intervene and take action during adult-to-adult domestic violent events. The recent national survey by David Finkelhor, Sherry Hamby, and their colleagues found that 49.9%, half of the children, yelled at their parents to stop during a domestic assault. Almost a quarter called for help. Almost half reported trying to get away from the violence at least once. In a study that I did in 4 cities across the country, 38% of children were reported to be accidentally hurt during an adult-to-adult domestic assault, often when they tried to intervene to protect their mothers. And a quarter, 26%, were intentionally hurt when they did intervene in those events. Long term, we have a number of longitudinal studies that have started to add questions about domestic violence exposure. And those studies have found that into teenage and adult relationships, that early exposure to domestic violence is highly associated with the use of violence and problems in teenage years and young adulthood. And in particular, the Adverse Child Experiences study in Southern California found a high co-occurrence that children exposed to domestic violence, over 50% of them had 5 or more other adverse child experiences co-occurring with that exposure to violence. So there was a very high, as David Finkelhor calls, polyvictimization. multiple victimization exposures. One bright spot is that significant numbers of children in all these studies of children exposed to domestic violence have been shown to have no greater problems than children not exposed. So between the group exposed and the not exposed group, you find significant differences. But when you look within that group of exposed children, you find that upwards to half of those children are not showing a great degree of problems. It could be that we're measuring poorly. It could be that we're not following up long enough. But I do think variation is really an important factor to keep in mind. That children have a different set, each child comes to a situation with a different set of protective and risk factors in their lives, and therefore will respond to the same events in different ways. And I think if there's one major take-home message I would hope you'd take from my talk today is that children have varied exposure to domestic violence. That often leads to varied impacts on them, and that we need varied responses to those children. That we can't just have child protection as the single response in most communities to children exposed to domestic violence, that we need much more of an analysis of what are the protective factors in their lives. Ms. Son talked earlier before lunch about the different adults on her block. It was very interesting to listen to that, but the protective adults that are in children's lives are very important. Protective factors, and I'd like to argue that battered mothers can be a significant protective factor for children, even if when they are being beaten, many of them are taking steps to try to protect their children. For example, I had a social worker in St. Paul, Minnesota tell me, well, she has gotten 3 orders for protection and gone to the shelter twice with her children. She cannot keep those kids safe. And so I would turn that around and say, well, that mom that's just 5 relatively difficult steps she's taking to protect her children, and there are probably hundreds of others that we're not even seeing recorded that she is taking. And so to turn that around and say she can't keep those kids safe, I think is a really negative attribution to what I see as protective steps by battered moms. There are a number of promising practices that have been developed, and certainly the Department of Justice has been promoting a variety of those. The ones that I find applied most directly to children exposed to domestic violence, the child-parent psychotherapy, Alicia Lieberman in San Francisco and Betsy McAllister Groves in Boston, Kids Club, which is Sandra Graham Berman, a children's group in shelters for children exposed to domestic violence, Project Support by Renee McDonald and Ernest Girillis down in Texas, and then the 4th R that comes out of Ontario, Canada, David Wolf, Peter Jaffe, and colleagues. There are a number of other great practices, and as Howard alluded to, I really want to end by stressing his 5th and 6th point, is that we do not have an infrastructure for developing evidence-based practice. There is huge pressure upon social services in this area and others to use evidence-based practices. But the few that are out there have gone through maybe a 10 to 15 year, as Stephen could probably attest to, 10 to 15 year development period with significant public funding to support that, testing, randomized clinical trials, as in the case with child-parent psychotherapy in San Francisco, that then is followed by a translation to the field. That's an intense process. And I've heard Betsy McAllister Groves talk about the process they've engaged in through the SAMHSA-supported, the National Traumatic Stress Network, that not only after the randomized clinical trial, they've spent years with mentoring and intensive training to try to translate that to the field. And I think that infrastructure, and that's Howard's 5th and 6th points, is that we need an infrastructure to support developing evidence-based practices, a variety of them that are out there that are great but don't have evidence behind them, to test those out and then translate what we find to the field. And there's very little support for that at this point in the field. So I'll close at that point.
Good afternoon. To this distinguished panel, it is my pleasure and honor to speak before you today to talk about children exposed to violence from a school perspective. And I know I have some comments that have already been written and submitted, but I want to speak from my heart because I believe that from the lens that I see young people, it's different from others. I'm always under the belief that children are raised to be respectful and responsible in society. And when young people are not in a home that is suitable for growth, academic growth, social growth, they begin to display negative behavior in our community. I can tell you from my position that oftentimes I'm speaking to young people myself as the chief of police. Some people think I've lost my mind because I put so much time into this job. But I believe it's important that young people hear from adults and adults hear from young people. Because in order for us to change a community, I think right now, as we live in this society with urban cities and the destruction of drugs and gangs in our community, we need to rebuild the family. We need to give the family the support, the services that are needed to rebuild that family, because oftentimes we find young people are being raised by their siblings because the parent is either working 2 or 3 jobs to support that home and or deceased, or the grandparents are stepping up to take over that parental and guardian responsibility. I believe if we look at the family in an open lens to understand that in order for young people to achieve academic success in learning environments, they must come from positive learning environments. Oftentimes, we have disruptive behavior and we call on our partners in the school system, one of which you will hear from in your next session. And it's called community conferencing. Well, what do we do in community conferencing? We bring families together. And when you have an opportunity to talk to families, you really find out the real core of the issue of why young people are behaving with such negative behavior in our community. But with community conferencing, it helps us to bridge the gap of what's going on and why are we in the position that we're in today in terms of disruptive behavior. Young people today, for some reason, do not want to use conflict resolution, but combat resolution into terms of altercations. So I set before you today to say that I believe that the biggest focus in violence today in our community is focusing on the family. What can we do to change a family, to change a young person? And I believe that to change a community, you have to change families one by one. As the actor said earlier, that in her community there were 2 families that she grabbed a hold of. I can tell you myself, I was raised by a single mom working 3 jobs. But I had a grandmother and I had an uncle who lived in a home with me. They taught me the benefits of working hard and succeeding. Well, in the position of chief of police in the school system, I try to talk to young people about my upbringing and where I came from, to let them know that my road was not easy. I had some stumbling blocks along the way. But I think if we take the time to give young people a voice in society today, we can change some of the violent behavior that's going on. But within our school system, as we all know, violence takes place in the community. It ultimately ends up back at the school. So what is the school left with limited resources to attack those issues that are coming in from the community? Well, we've reached out to many partners within the city of Baltimore to address the violent behavior, the disruptive behavior, to bring some calm to the storm before the storm really erupts in our school system. I can tell you that in our school system, our students have taken a survey. Our students have taken a survey and said that the school is the safest place to be. Now that tells me that we have a problem between school and home and school. So what do we have? We have limited resources that will address the issues between school and home. We have limited resources for after-school programs. We have limited resources for athletic events. So what is left for a young person to encounter but violence, because they then go from a positive structure, which is the school, back to the community where there's negativity in between the school and home, and they want to be a part of a family. I remember hearing my first case dealing with gangs in the city of Baltimore, and the young person said, well, I want to be a part of something. So I said to him, why not be a part of an educational system where you can succeed academically and achieve growth? And he said, well, I have some issues. So offline, I took a little walk with a young man, and he said to me, sir, you have to understand where I'm coming from. And I said, where are you coming from? He said, well, my mother's deceased, my father's incarcerated. what do? It's tough to respond to young people if you do not have the resources to guide them in the right direction to overcome that which has impeded their bodies and their minds and their hearts. I believe that the educational system is the right place for any young person to achieve, but I think resources are badly needed, overly needed, and they need to be imploded in the elementary school level where we can grab young people at an early age. I think starting with young people in high school and middle school is not the answer today. We need to be starting with young people from pre-K straight on through the 12th grade. And I can tell you through our GREAT program and our DARE program that my officers are conducting in the elementary school, we are attempting to make a difference in young people's lives. And I think from a police perspective, it's not about locking up every young person that violates the student code of conduct or violates the law. It's about finding the resources to help that young person. I'm often asking when my officers are dealing with young people, what's going on with that student? Have you talked to that student today? Do you know what happened last night in that home? Because oftentimes what's happening in the home is having an adverse effect on a young person when they come to school. I saw a young lady was sleeping in class a lot, and I asked the teacher what is going on. She said, well, Chief, you have to understand, this young lady is taking care of her family. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, Mom works the midnight shift, so she's responsible for clothing the students, feeding the students, making sure their homework is done, and by the time she gets to bed from doing her homework, she's extremely tired. So she has to get up the next day and get ready, get the siblings ready, get herself ready. She's late for school, so she's sleeping in school. An adult must recognize that. An adult must know that a young person is in need of help, and oftentimes when those students do not receive that help, they ultimately go into the street and begin to create a disturbance somewhere in our community, regardless if it's gangs, prostitution, or robbing, or being just totally disrupting in our community. So I would venture to say to the panel, to the task force, that if the necessary resources are in place for young people today in our society, I think we can make a difference as adults in their lives. But we have to put the necessary resources in place to support young people and also give them a voice. And we try to do that in our school system by reaching out to various intervention and prevention programs to have young people to be a part of that. I truly believe that in order to overcome the violence in our community, we need to put the resources in the right place where young people can achieve academically and grow professionally in our communities. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to share with you some thoughts about violence in our nation's juvenile justice system. I have had the incredible honor, but also experienced the tremendous heartbreak of representing children who are imprisoned throughout the Deep South. And these children are like children who are imprisoned throughout the country. The vast majority of them have committed very low-level offenses. And that's a very disturbing fact when you think about the fact that we spend millions of dollars imprisoning children for very, very minor offenses. But what's even more disturbing is the violence and the abuse and the trauma that these children often experience when they're behind bars. There's no dollar amount we can put on the number of young lives that have been destroyed by violence experienced inside our juvenile justice systems. I'd like to share with you just a few stories of some of the children that I have worked with. In May 2007, a 16-year-old girl was left alone with a staff member who was under investigation for sexually abusing another resident in that facility. She was brutally sexually abused, and that same staff member went on to abuse 3 other girls before he was finally removed from his position. In that same facility, 7 girls were shackled for over a month because they were an alleged runaway threat. In October 2009, a detention center implemented a policy of keeping the children locked down for 23 hours a day. If children would come to the front of their cells to request water, to have to go to the bathroom, the staff would spray them in their face with mace and tell them to get to the back of their cells. In one particularly brutal and corrupt private prison that houses young men ages 13 to 22 who are tried and convicted as adults, in the last 3 years, there's been 3 suicides, a number of rapes, and staff-instigated youth-on-youth assaults that have resulted in a number of youth receiving permanent injuries, including permanent brain damage and other very serious injuries. These examples all occurred in the Deep South, but prison abuse for children isn't in just one region of the country. According to a report by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, since 1970, there have been 57 lawsuits in 33 states where courts have ordered specific remedies and actions by detention centers to address unconstitutional and abusive conditions. So who are the children who are experiencing this abuse? Well, the data suggests that state juvenile justice systems are targeting Black and brown youth. African American youth are 41% of our nation's population, yet they represent 69% of all children who are detained. These children experience a lot of the violence that I just spoke about, then they're released back into their communities. This is why the violence and abuse suffered by children caught up in our juvenile justice system affects us all. Evidence also suggests that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered youth are also disproportionately caught up in our juvenile justice system, often for reasons related to their orientation. Sometimes when youth come out, they get disconnected from their families and are forced to live on the streets. That can be a direct path into the juvenile justice system. Other times, these youth are defending themselves against pervasive bullying that happens in the community and on the streets. A report by the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana suggests that these youth are very vulnerable to sexual abuse while imprisoned. In this report, a number of youth talked about being forced, being sexually assaulted, being forced to perform sexual acts, or experience physical violence. Children living with mental illness and girls are also particularly vulnerable to abuse while they're imprisoned. There's another population that has grown tremendously over the past few years that is also very vulnerable to abuse, and that's children who are imprisoned in our adult correctional facilities. The juvenile justice system was initially created to protect children from the harsh, punitive environment of the adult correctional facilities. In the 1990s, in a wave of sort of tough on crime policies, this was reversed, and a lot of states began to allow children to be tried and convicted as adults. And it's in these facilities where we've seen some of the most brutal abuses. Supposedly, children are sent to prison in an effort to reduce crime and violence in our communities. But in reality, the act of imprisoning a child can create more crime and more violence than it actually solves. Based on recidivism rates, one thing we know is that secure confinement is the one proven ineffective way to address juvenile crime. And we also know that abuse and violence is often endemic in these facilities. My written testimony contains a number of detailed recommendations for the task force. I'll briefly summarize them here. I hope the task force will consider urging Congress to reauthorize and strengthen the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. I also hope the task force will ensure that the Prison Rape Elimination Act will address the needs of detained youth. Both of these statutes should have a prohibition on housing children in adult facilities. I hope the task force will consider making recommendations to state-level officials that they reform their system and systemically reduce the number of children who are imprisoned by developing alternatives to incarceration that are data-driven and that can save states money. Like many of the other panelists have noted, a critical component of these alternatives will be to engage families and communities in the rehabilitative system. Investing in families is one of the surest ways we can reduce our nation's reliance on incarceration. Of course, even with all of these policies, some children will still end up behind bars, and it's absolutely critical that we do whatever we can to protect these youth from violence. States should be encouraged to develop strong, independent oversight for all prisons and jails for any facility that houses children. So, in conclusion, I'd like to commend the task force for recognizing the silent epidemic of violence behind the walls of the prisons that house our children, and for recognizing that this is a crisis that resounds far beyond those walls into all of our communities.
Thank you. Questions?
Ms. Beatty, on the question of children in detention facilities and placement facilities and adult confinement, do you have any recommendations on the issue of children being held in isolation, either from the point of view of the length of time or the circumstances or conditions of children held in isolation?
My recommendation would be that children should never be housed in isolation. It is one of the most devastating things for a child from a developmental perspective to be housed alone in a cell without contact with staff. What we've seen in some of the facilities that we're working in, where there's an outright prohibition on isolation, that severe behavior issues can be dealt with adequate staffing and with other consequences for negative behavior. Kids will break rules, but there are ways to give them consequences that won't affect their developmental process.
Is there any research that you have on this issue that might be a benefit to the task force?
There certainly is, and I'd be happy to provide that to you. There's a significant amount of research on the developmental effects of isolation on children.
Thank you.
Just jump off on that one as well. Is there a place you could cite within the United States that, as a best practice, would be a model?
On the issue of isolation?
Yeah.
I believe that the Missouri juvenile justice system has a model behavior management program that does not rely on isolation.
I want to thank all of you for your powerful testimonies. I did have a question for maybe all of you that can answer this. You all provide a wealth of information, specifically in your individual fields. I wanted to know if you worked comprehensively with other experts in the field, and if that and how that information gets transferred to the community residents themselves. Since we know that awareness is one of the main things that we need to tackle, how is that information being shared?
So I think the first part was the extent to which we work with other experts or folks in different disciplines. Was that? So right here, I'm at the medical school across the street. I would say everything we do is interdisciplinary and involves usually 4, 5, 6 disciplines. I couldn't be here for part of the morning because we have a new project on training law enforcement officers about investigating child abuse and neglect, and I had to go to that meeting. So I think the nature of this problem really requires the different disciplines and fields to work together. It's not just a nice idea, it's a necessity. I think in terms of your second question of how do we do in conveying information to the public, let me first say I think we could do a lot better. I'll include myself in our projects. That often does not get enough attention. But just one example is where in Maryland we have an effort to develop statewide medical expertise in the field of child abuse and neglect. And on the website, there's lots of info that would be useful to parents as well. So it's one small example, but much to be done.
Thank you, each and every one, for your excellent testimony. Dr. DuBois, let me start with you. As you know, I agree with everything you say. I have a question. First of all, are there 39 or 29 nations who have ratified the treaty?
29. Sorry for the typo.
29. Okay. Some.
No, it's not this.
Which treaty?
No.
The treaty on the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, the International Treaty on the Rights of the Child.
I'm sorry, they're two separate issues. The 39, which is really 29, refers to the number of countries that have banned hitting kids, period. Totally separate from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, where all but 2, Somalia and us, have ratified
Many
it.
more than 39. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question about each of them. Of the 29 who have banned corporal punishment, 29 countries. Do we have any data that shows a reduction in the amount of injury to children or child abuse in those countries, from those countries?
So there are some data. Perhaps the best are from Sweden. It's true, though, that at the time that the Swedes passed their law, there already was a majority public sentiment against hitting kids. But that the rate of parents approving of corporal punishment or hitting kids did decline, continue to decline after the law was passed. So it's a great question. It's often tricky to pinpoint to just the law making that difference. But that's perhaps the best example in Sweden, where increasing numbers of parents agreed that hitting kids should not be allowed.
So it's really a public information, public affairs challenge as well as a legal one. The general message that corporal punishment is not effective and can result in injury is probably the message that needs to get out there. I think we'll probably sooner see movement in banning capital punishment than corporal punishment. And both of those will be sooner than ratifying the International Treaty on the Rights of the Child. I can remember meeting with the State Department 15 years ago and basically being told, well, we can't really ratify this because we have to abide by it, whereas all those other countries can just sign it and then not abide by the requirements of it. Now, then it was a State Department issue. You're saying Congress. Are we not thinking anymore that the State Department would be able to at least, do we need the entire Congress to ratify it, or can the State Department do that?
67 senators.
67 senators on the recommendation of the State Department, right?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so that's what we have to work toward. Thank you very much. Now I have one more question. Oh, go ahead.
Can I just add,
Yeah.
I spoke in Northern Europe last year, and what struck me was that with the Convention on the Rights of the Child in place, people were talking about what is a child's right within a child protection system, which was a really different perspective than you see among American researchers and even American policymakers. So I do think that the convention does bring a different perspective, and when applied well, really speaks to what are children's rights. How do we hear children's voices in the child protection system? Are we concerned about a child's rights and their voices? And so I do think it brings a different emphasis once it's in place in some countries.
And there is a link with capital punishment because it would ban capital punishment for minors, as I recall. I have a question, Ms. Beatty. I'm sorry to take so much time, but there's a huge issue with respect to incarcerated or detained youth, and that is that of the women, a large percentage of them are pregnant or have children, very small children, usually outside the jail. So have you taken a look at what is done with the pregnant girls, what kind of treatment, and once the young woman gives birth, what the practice is in terms of keeping the baby and the mother together, separating them, what kind of parenting? Is there any effort to achieve a level of positive parenting with these young people?
Well, one of the issues with young women who are imprisoned is that prison is sort of a one-size-fits-all thing, and that for a lot of these girls, they're sort of expected to kind of fit into a model that was created for the majority, which is males. The largest number of young people who are imprisoned are young men. So when we've worked with young women who are pregnant while imprisoned, that creates a whole lot of complications for both the young woman and the facility staff. And we've had to advocate for them for things as simple as ensuring that they're getting nutritious food, that they're not being served cold lunch meat sandwiches, which pregnant women can't eat. So I do feel like a lot of these facilities that are used to dealing with, number one, young men, and number two, children, are not equipped to deal with the needs of young women who are pregnant. When these young women have their children, and most of them end up going into the foster care system, unless there's sort of a very strong, stable family unit.
Thank you.
I have a question to Chief Marshal Goodwin. Thank you very much for your excellent comments. And I in particular paid attention to your statement that our children today don't want to use conflict resolution but combat solutions. And in keeping with that, I'd like to ask you from the perspective of violence in schools. Do you feel that since the American Academy of Pediatrics and others have stated now that children spend more time in front of media than they do in school, 7 hours a day is the average, do you believe that the role of violent video gaming is a contributor to some of the violent resolutions that we are seeing in school children?
I would agree with you. It goes in line with the social networking. Young people use that mechanism as a mechanism of violence as well. You hear oftentimes, what is it, 360? I'm trying to remember the games that the kids use. Oftentimes we find Xbox 360. I tell you, I don't know. The kids are using those instruments to perform acts of violence. They're also mimicking what they see on TV. So yes, I would say media and instruments of games of that type have an impact on students' behavior as well.
I'm going to resist getting into the controversial findings about the impact of media. But there, just suffice it to say that there are far more kids who are playing what I might find toxic and noxious video games who don't do anything but well in school and socially, etc. But Chief, I had a specific question. First of all, thank you to all the panelists. It was really quite wonderful being able to listen to my colleagues and people who I'm just meeting. But Chief, you mentioned many times that you used the word resources, and I thought you described beautifully the idea of kids who don't have the families that we wish they had. They still need something from somewhere, right? So if you were to put into a few words, and maybe it's a long list, but it can be as long as you want, if you were to make some suggestions to this task force about what you would like your officers to have on their utility belts in terms of helping kids, and if you would like to be able to think about what preparation you'd like your officers to have and the concrete resources, what would be a few of them?
Well, first and foremost, I try to give my officers the opportunity to be trained across the lines in terms of student behavior, mental health issues and services, so that when we encounter young people, we're able to address their issues and even provide them with a referral or the guidance or the adult in the building who's assigned to handle that type of issue. Resources with respect to employment opportunities. Sometimes if you can just lead a young person in a direction that can change a behavior pattern, with health to mental health, social services, training with young people. I think if young people have an opportunity to train alongside officers, as we do in the GREAT program and the DARE program, that to me has made a tremendous impact on young people in our school system. And I'm constantly pushing to get volunteers within my police force to do this. Sometimes it's amazing what can happen when you get an officer trained to present to young people how the hidden treasures of them can come out to provide young people with an opportunity. But more importantly, I think having the necessary resource to help kids extend their day with officers' input, I think would play a major role in some constructive programming to be a part of every school. We're starting this weekend with a Saturday school in several of our Baltimore schools. I believe we need that throughout the district, because I believe if young people are retained to engage in additional academic learning, then those possibilities of going down the wrong side of the road will be more effective in having those resources to support students.
One quick follow-up question. Of those resources, and there is something special, isn't there, about the use of authority for a kid who doesn't have enough. You know, it can be a pretty cool thing suddenly to have a friend who's a cop. But quick question. Of those resources, this can be yes or no, you can go on, but do you have enough of them right now?
No, I don't.
Things you
No. I'll be very honest with you, sir. If I could get more resources to help my staff and had more resources to have more officers, I would like to have an officer in every school. At this point, I do not. We have 142 personnel for 203 schools, and in some of our schools, we have multiple officers who are assigned around. I think additional resources will certainly help me to manage the system better. But I believe if every kid is shown some love, we can change this whole process. Thank you.
Father.
The society, draws lines. This is a question for Sheila. And we'll say a 16-year-old shouldn't smoke or drink or vote or serve in the military. But the minute that 16-year-old commits an egregious crime that we'll all agree is bad, then suddenly the goalpost moves, and suddenly this kid is an adult. And we're still the only country on the planet Earth that sentences children to die in prison. And I couldn't agree with you more when you recommend that legislatively or however people do this, that we end the practice of trying children as adults. But in your own experience, how do we do that? How do you create a movement? How do you create the tipping point where, because it shifted, and I think it did because of the super predator myth and the scare, and juvenile crime is the myth that it was on the rise, as we heard earlier. What do you recommend? How do you get at this?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about one of the successes we had in Mississippi with some legislative reform on this issue. When I first started working in Mississippi in 2003, the juvenile justice facilities, 80% of the children who were in there were status offenders. So they were in there for things like truancy, running away, skipping school. And these were pure status offenders. And the Department of Justice documented this number. So if we had 80% in the juvenile justice facilities, these low-level kids, it's no wonder that then in the adult facility, we had the kids who were committing actual crimes. The hydraulics of the system are really important to think about when we're considering reform. When we were able to make the case that it made no financial sense for a poor state like Mississippi to lock up kids who are essentially, these are not non-criminal offenses, we were able to get the first-time offenders, status offenders out of the system. We then were able to create the space, and there was then the sense that, oh my goodness, we have all of these kids in the adult system, and we have all these empty beds in the juvenile justice system. So it's about looking at the system in the entirety, because so many jurisdictions are locking up in the juvenile justice system kids who frankly don't need to be there. And as a result, other kids are getting bumped up into the adult system. And the other thing I'll say on this is that the research has evolved significantly, and we know so much about the recidivism rates for kids who go into the adult system. It doesn't work. It's worse than for what happens for kids in the juvenile justice system, and that data is pretty compelling, even for even for lawmakers who are very concerned about being tough on crime.
Mason.
Thank you, all of you, for your commitment to your work, and I think your commitment to being visible today and telling the truth about some hard facts. But unfortunately, the facts go back decades and decades. So I think we have made some improvement, but around the edges. So I wanted to ask a more generalized question to the whole panel. In different ways, you've all mentioned this, but maybe we can start with Howard to put you on the spot, or you all could help him out. Maybe you already have a ready answer, but Howard mentioned the underpinnings of violence a number of times, and so I'm wondering what you would consider the top 3 underpinnings of violence, just to help our task force to understand how you look at violence. I think there are some definition issues we're going to have to grapple with as we move forward. In other words, you might say, what is the face of violence? Is there something underneath violence that causes the violence? Or is violence the root behavior?
So the top 3 contributors to violence, is that the question? Okay. Boy, how to order them. Okay, well, I think, let me suggest, come back to the point about the extent to which our culture accepts hitting kids is no small part of this. It sends a powerful message that when I'm mad at you, I can hit you. That's okay. And when we disagree, how do we resolve it? By hitting. So I think from an early age, this is very powerful. I remember as a pediatrician seeing a 10-month-old swat his mom sitting in front of me in the office. And I was curious, where did this come from? Where did the 10-month-old learn this? And sure enough, not that there's always cause and effect in this way, she had been already swatting him. So I think we need to start early. And so I think that's one. I think the panel several times has emphasized the extent to which families are struggling to cope with their kids in a variety of ways and are unable to protect them, to nurture them in the ways that would allow them a good beginning. And so just a few blocks from here, if folks haven't read it, it's called The Corner. The Corner is about 6 blocks from here. And for folks like me, it's an amazing description of what breeds violence. What I refer to as a neighborhood that's stuck with crime, with drugs, and when the kids have lousy opportunities. So I think obviously these are big, daunting challenges, but if we could help many more families do a lot better at nurturing their kids, we'd be in much better shape.
I don't know that I have 3, but I'd like to put it in the context of protective and risk factors, that certainly exposure of a child to direct victimization or indirect exposure to violence in their home, in their community, and school is clearly identified in the research literature as a predictor, or at least highly associated, statistical predictor of puts you at risk for greater violence later in your life. I think that co-occurring with a variety of other risk factors in a child's life and the absence of those other protective factors like the adults that Ms. Son talked about combine to create a canvas in which it's highly likely that a child will become violent. I do think a partial solution to that we haven't really addressed, one is prevention. We really haven't done a good job of primary prevention of social norms, the advertising that Howard was talking about, developing the social norms against violence in this country, engaging communities in violence prevention, engaging men and boys in violence prevention. I also think we have done very little to engage informal supporters of children. So adults and others in their lives who are the first that children and adult victims turn to. It's going to be family and friends. And we do very little to support family and friends' ability to respond in a positive, supportive way and somehow then connect children to those community services that are important. And then I think that this is more to the solutions than the 3 risks you asked about, but I also think we need greater capacity to respond to children outside of the child welfare system, and that's going to be in community-based services. Maybe some that exist already, but expand their capacity to respond to children exposed to violence, and some that don't exist and could be created.
So I will venture to say the issue that I've constantly spoke about over the years, and that is redeveloping the family. I think without the family, it brings on violence because young people need that love and nurturing in the home. And if that's not there, they ultimately go to the street. And I think if services and resources were made available to redirect and redefine the family, as well as more positive activities after school and on Saturdays, I think that would play a major role in changing this system.
I think that violence often happens in the juvenile justice system because of this sense among many juvenile justice stakeholders that there are some kids that it's okay to throw away some kids, that there are some kids that are just not worth investing in. And I think in many systems across the country, that's sort of the pervasive culture of the system. I also think there's something that's more fundamental when it comes to violence in the juvenile justice system, and that is the very structure of the facilities themselves. When you take over 100 teenagers, many of whom have been living with trauma for their whole lives, some of whom are prone to make bad decisions, and put them in a facility with 4 or 5 staff people, violence is almost inevitable. So that there is something about the very way we've structured the system that breeds violence.
I want to thank our panel for their very informative and impactful testimony, and we're going to take a 5-minute break while we seat our next panel.